Thank you very much, John, for that kind invitation. I'm delighted to be back in Budapest, and I want to thank you and Melissa for the kind invitation to join you this evening. One small correction from the generous introduction. I'm a member of the Croatian Parliament, not the European Parliament. I wish I had the salary of European Parliament representatives, but I don't. I represent just poor Croatia for the time being. So it's a very timely subject this evening. You mentioned countries that haven't joined the euro up till now. Croatia will be removed from that list, I'm sad to say, on January 1st. So the current government has as one of its top priorities Croatia joining the Eurozone, and this will happen effectively on January 1. I've been quite critical about this in my public remarks for some time, and I'll try to outline some of the reasons for my skepticism here. I'll try to finish in about 15 minutes. I'm not an economist, so that's just for full disclosure. I teach political philosophy and courses dealing with the history of Western civilization, but I have followed the trajectory of the euro since it was introduced in Europe. I was actually serving as a diplomat in Germany at the time when the Germans were relinquishing the Deutsche Mark for the euro. And there was some skepticism at the time in Germany from the beginning. But it was one of the main priorities. I would remind you all of Helmut Kohl at the time. He saw it as a way of binding a newly unified Germany to Europe and ensuring that Germany's trading partners could not gain advantages over German products by devaluing their currencies. Now, I think in many ways, Kohl was correct. Looking back over the past 20 years, it's generally been a good deal for Germany and for the strongest economies in the euro area, I would say. This includes the Netherlands, other economies that are high export, very competitive economies. The euro has not been an obstacle to strong economic growth. The story has been quite different for economies in Southern Europe. And I would include my own country in this group. We're soon to join the euro, and my view is that instead of implementing more difficult reforms, structural reforms, changing the public health system, reforming the pension system, bringing down public spending, the government, instead of doing that, which is more perhaps a difficult task, it's decided to introduce the euro as a new measure that's designed to help our economy. The public opinion polls in Croatia are mixed. I would say established opinion, the conventional wisdom among elites, people who are in mainstream political parties and are talking heads on television, more or less are advocating for the euro. The common person on the streets, I would say, is much more skeptical. And there was a discussion last year about perhaps holding a referendum on the currency, and the government was very much opposed to this. The main argument being that when Croatia joined the European Union in 2013, it had already at that time agreed to eventually introduce the euro as its currency. So the government was basically arguing that it's already a commitment that Croatia has assumed, and that there's no point in asking the people what they think about this. So that was a convenient, I would say, way out of this discussion of a possible referendum. It was not to be, and so we're set to join. And like I said, I think our economy has not been reformed to the extent that we are competitive enough to gain benefits from the euro. I'm afraid that it could be an obstacle to our growth. It's complicated. Most of our trade is done within the euro area, but I'm afraid that this harmonization that big countries, including Germany, are pushing for will be a major price to pay. this loss of the small monetary sovereignty that we've had up till now will be gone for good. For good. And this is a serious political question. When Germans advocate for harmonization, they basically want fiscal and tax policy to be harmonized to the extent that they control more or less the conditions within the Eurozone. So this small space allowing for countries to compete with each other and perhaps attract foreign investment, keep taxes low, and so on, this possibility will become I would say more difficult to achieve for Croatia in the future once we join, and that's a worry for me. I represent a new conservative party called the Homeland Movement, Domovinski Pokret in Croatian, and we're very skeptical and cautious when looking at generally the centralization of power in Brussels and in institutions outside of Croatia, far from the eyes and ears of the average citizen. I remember when the Greek bailout was a major topic of discussion from the last Euro crisis. The government in Slovakia actually fell, and they had early elections because Slovakia was opposed to paying into this bailout fund. And I was doing research on this issue. One of the main reasons, in my view, Greece has not been allowed to leave the Eurozone, even though it's been, in a way, a source of many problems from the beginning, is that the Greek debt largely is owned by French and German banks. Huge amounts of money owned by French and German banks, and it's much easier and feasible for German and French politicians to lobby for a bailout fund instead of allowing a uncompetitive country to leave the common currency area and open the possibility for these banks to lose huge sums of money and perhaps go bankrupt. So that's the political landscape, that all of the European citizens involved in the euro are asked from time to time to bail out problem countries. And this is becoming, I'm afraid, a plausible scenario for countries that are even bigger than Greece. Italy, for example. So what happens if Italy needs a bailout? How much will that cost? In the Croatian public debate, this has not even been mentioned as a possible risk of joining the euro, that perhaps our government, our citizens will be asked to pay into a bailout fund designed to help a struggling economy that's not ours. And so there's precedent for this. As I said, it could happen again. And my main worry is that this promise of convergence, something that economists were promising from the very beginning, that the common currency would bring this convergence effect and would raise the standard of living in poor economies and bring them closer to the more developed competitive economies. This has not happened, in fact. This has not happened. And so we have more or less countries like Portugal, Italy, Greece, struggling on the verge of recession for extended periods of time. They have very low rates of growth. And the euro area in general, compared to the US, for example, if we look at over the last 15 to 20 years, has struggled. So there are lower growth rates than in the United States. Now, the economists have, I'm sure, better explanations for this than what I can offer, but that's a reality, that it has not allowed all the countries involved to grow in a faster way at higher rates than they were before. And so in a way, you could say that's a clear failure and something that has not transpired but was promised at the time. So basically, I see it as more or less a tool for deeper political integration. It's clear once you join the euro, it's almost impossible to leave. So this monetary sovereignty is relinquished for good. That's a serious issue. And for governments, our current government included, the Prime Minister is an enthusiastic Eurocrat. He spent much of his career trying to get Croatia into the European Union, working as a diplomat in Brussels. And so I can understand his way of thinking. But for the average person living in Croatia, I think it will not yield benefits. I'm afraid that for our companies, it will be difficult, even more difficult, to compete with the more competitive. And we're losing this small lever that we've had up till now. We have not devalued the kuna since it's been, linked to the euro for some time now. So we've had a fixed currency exchange rate for some time, and the economy, it's growing, but I would say not fast enough. And so one of the results of this, of Croatia not pushing through reforms that I think were long overdue, is that we're losing our population. And that's a general problem in Europe. Low reproductive rates, a declining population, an aging population. I read just recently that the largest employer lobbying group in Germany is worried about the pension system in Germany collapsing. It's facing collapse. And they're warning about this. They're saying this publicly. So we have a demographic crisis generally. We have economies with their welfare state models that are very expensive, relying more and more on migrant workers. Croatia will soon be part of this group, I'm afraid, because so much of our working population has left the country in the last 10 years. We've lost nearly 10% of our population since 2011. The new census figures just came out. So there's a huge price for not implementing reforms and having an uncompetitive economy. And my point is that introducing the euro will not change any of this. The average person, when he's asked on the street, looks to Slovenia. Slovenia introduced the euro many years ago, and Slovenes were complaining from the very beginning that it caused price increases on many projects. That's what they saw immediately. That was an obvious effect, that things became more expensive, not less expensive. And that's how the average Croatian, I would say, sees this now. They're very worried. We have inflation already now, and people are worried that things will become even more expensive after January 1. And that's probably, the skepticism is one of the reasons the government was very much determined to avoid holding a referendum on this issue. There's generally today in Europe this view among elites that it's not good to allow the people to have more of a say. And I think that's a big problem, actually, to be honest. I think we all have in Central Europe the very harmful legacy of communism that still lingers. Many of the media elites, the people still in academia in Croatia, in our political environment, come from the old communist system. They didn't just disappear. They retained their positions of power. And they would prefer the people not have a voice. They're very much, I would say, inclined to follow the lead of Brussels instead of listening to the worries of their own population. And I think that's a pattern in many countries in Central and Eastern Europe. This, I would say, estrangement from the average person and kind of a servile, I would describe it as a servile attitude in Brussels. Too willing to follow the lead of bureaucrats, or you could describe many of the people in the European Commission as has been politicians, failed politicians who remain powerful through their positions in Brussels, but many of them failed as national leaders in their own countries. I'm afraid. And so I would agree with many critics who say that Europe is being led today by people who are not fit to lead, who are incompetent, weak, and driving the continent into a very dangerous direction. That's my own view. And so Croatia, I think, should wake up, should take a more critical approach to what's happening around us, maybe look to countries like Poland and Hungary that, in my view, have more self-confidence in pushing back and contradicting the conventional wisdom in Brussels. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Can you?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Thanks. Sim, before you go back, I'd just like to ask you one question, as I will do with the other speakers, and that is, you've just given us a very interesting political analysis of the situation of a country which may adopt the euro. Now, most people, I think, will remember that one of the countries which suffered quite considerably as a result of being in the euro at the time following the 2008 financial crisis was Ireland. And Ireland was found itself in exactly the position you were describing, as having to pay, the Irish taxpayers paid a very large chunk of debts because of the collapse of Irish banks. And that occurred because there were other countries which would have suffered if the banks had not been bailed out by the Irish taxpayer. As I say, it was a very severe bailout on the backs of the Irish taxpayer. It was a very significant loss of wealth. Now, that succeeded extraordinarily well because the Irish population is perhaps the most pro-EU population in the whole of Europe. And there was a kind of pride in the sacrifice that Irish people had made to bail out the Irish banks and to bail out Europe, in effect. And now, let me ask you this. In the event that your taxpayers found themselves on the hook in a similar situation for significant debts, what, in your view, would be the reaction of the ordinary taxpayer? Well, the popular reaction in your country, would it be as, well, it wasn't even passive, I was about to say passive, it was an active support on the part of the Irish. What, in your view, would be the reaction of the people in Croatia?
Much different, I think, much different. So the Croatian mood, I would describe, they're not enthusiastic about the euro. Since we've joined the European Union in July of 2013, we've had a demographic collapse. So one of the things that I bring up is that Croatia, because we have public education through high school, through university, in many ways, our taxpayers are subsidizing now, and for years now, qualified workers, highly educated workers, doctors, engineers, many of them who, after they get a free education or a subsidized education in Croatia, go elsewhere and work to Germany, Austria. So it's been a very good deal for Germany. Does that make sense for Croatia? No. And since we've joined Europe, I would say there's been many benefits, but many of the average people looking at their standard of living have not seen tangible improvement. And so there's this, on one side, demographic collapse, and on the other, skepticism about how good it is for the average person in Croatia, because we're still sadly at the lower end of most of these rankings in Europe. So I would say, because there's relative low enthusiasm, if there were a crisis and the taxpayers would be asked to finance a bailout, it would be a huge political problem. It would be a huge political problem. And I go back to this question of sovereignty. Being in Hungary, it's good to remind the audience, Croatia in the in the medieval period, we lost our political sovereignty in 1102 when the Croatian nobility recognized the Hungarian king in 1102. And 800 years later, in the 20th century, we were still not a sovereign country. We were, after World War I, no longer part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and things got actually worse because we were ruled from Belgrade instead of Vienna. So things have just gotten worse for Croatia in the last 100 years, and that's why sovereignty, national sovereignty, is such a sensitive issue for us. And the people are not, I think, convinced from the arguments they've heard, offered by politicians, that this is a win-win. I think deep down there's this anxiety that things will be difficult. They see that in places like in Greece and Italy, the euro has not caused high growth, but it's more or less been, you could say, one of the reasons for these countries to lag behind, I would say. So, like I said, it's easier for a government to introduce the euro than to push through a change in the health or pension system. And so politically, I can understand why our prime minister has decided to do this, but I think he has not convinced the public that it's in their interest. He has the elite opinion backing him, but I don't think he has won the hearts and minds of the majority of the population. That's my own sense. And so if there were a crisis, like I said, I think it would be a huge political problem in Croatia, because there isn't this sense of pride that exists perhaps in Ireland. Ireland joined the EU much earlier, has had much more, I would say, a greater benefit from all the structural funds, from all the EU funding, the redistribution of money going through these schemes in Brussels. And so we're the latest member, and if things were to go south, it would create a huge, huge problem in Croatia.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen.